Excellent. There's a few people just trickling in, and then we'll kick off. Perfect. Okay, assuming that everybody can see the screen and everybody can hear me, we will make a start. For those of you who haven't been to webinar before, we'll do a quick introduction just to say there's normally two of us, but Sharon has been stuck at the hospital. The person who's supposed to be handing over to him basically didn't turn up, so he's stuck as the medical registrar at the hospital. So I feel like I've still got the easier job. I'd much rather be chatting to you guys than be looking after all the patients coming into the hospital. So for those of you who've never been here before, there's lots of new names this week. My name's Travis, and we'll be taking you through the BMAT this evening. For those of you who haven't met medic admissions before, our idea, we started up because we found that overall there was lots of really poor entrance stuff around for medical, people who want to be medical students. Long and short of it is lots of people get a place at medical school and they think it's a really good way to make money just to try and help other people, but actually their only experience is getting their own place at medical school, and it just seems a bit like a cash grab, to be honest with you. So we started up medic admissions to help people get into medical school, to get into dental school, and then throughout that we help people get into their jobs as a doctor. We help people apply for core training as doctors. We help people apply as registrars as doctors. So kind of we help people all along the way, and we do that through sort of experience and just different entry techniques and things. So normally there would be two of us. As I say, you're stuck with me tonight, but Sharon would usually join us. So I'm an Imperial graduate, started out as a scientist actually, and then did the graduate entry route to medicine. I apologize if I keep looking away, I'm just trying to admit people at the same time. So yeah, I was a graduate into medicine, I went to Imperial. I interviewed for Imperial for about 4 or 5 years, and then moved down into the Bristol area where I met Sharon, and basically really enjoy helping people get into medicine because I've met so many students and doctors who would make excellent medical students, but just never get the opportunity, whether that's through lifestyle or just, you know, practice. Because sadly, the more that you invest in this, certain people can do really well. And that's a real shame, we thought. So that's kind of where we came from. So the idea of tonight is to go through the BMAT, which is quite a scary exam, I think. I remember when I had to do it for Imperial. It's very different to the UCAT. It takes a different sort of stance. And although there's some overlap, it's very different. So the idea is to give you a bit of a whistle-stop tour. We're going to go through what the exam is, how it's laid out, which medical schools use it, what sort of scores you need, and then some tips for each section. So we'll break down each section, try and open people's eyes. So if you're starting your revision, then it's a great way of kind of opening your eyes to exactly what you've got coming. And hopefully, even if you've done a bit of practice, it's something that you can use to kind of augment that. And there might be a few things that we've thought of that you haven't come across yet. Perfect. As we're going through, if anybody's got any questions, do pop them in the chat. Normally, I would try and answer them as I'm going. It'll depend on whether or not I see it as we go. So if I don't answer it as it comes up, I'll definitely come back to them at the end. So if anybody's got any questions, just pop them in the chat and we can certainly go through it. Somebody just quickly asked how long. We'll aim to go for about 45 minutes to an hour, depending on how many questions we've got. They shouldn't be much longer than that. Perfect. So for those of you, I'm sure are aware, due to the coronavirus issues at the moment, there is no September sitting for the BMAT. Now, this is probably the biggest change this year, and it has a massive impact on how you kind of strategize your medical application. The reason for that is obviously you have to do the November sitting, and you have to put your application for medicine in October. So effectively, you'll be putting your application in not knowing what your BMAT results are. And that is very different to the UCAT and normally the September sitting of the BMAT, because you would know your results before you apply, and you'd be able to kind of tailor what you're doing, which makes a massive difference. So I think that's something to really consider when you're thinking about applying to a BMAT university, is whether or not you're comfortable enough to know that when you apply, you won't know how well you've done. Other little things, if you're looking at past papers, they've changed section 1 to 32 from 35 questions. So there's 3 less questions, which is possibly a nice thing, a little bit more time. And you'll also not have the large, long passage questions. So if you flick through the old past papers, there'd be at least one question where you get like a page of text and then you'd be asked questions on it. In my experience, these used to take a lot of time just to read through all the information. And so I think this is actually a really nice change. It should make the exam slightly less time pressured. However, it doesn't mean we don't know what they're going to replace it with. They could be slightly more difficult questions. Perfect. So who uses it? So these are basically your universities. If you're thinking of applying to any of these are the ones that use the BMAT. Interestingly, Oxford never allowed you to apply for the September sitting. You always had to use a November sitting. Manchester and Kiel only ask for the BMAT for very specific groups of people. So it's worth checking whether or not that's you. Just have a look. Kiel call it their overseas for fees applicants, and Manchester, it's a specific group of international applicants. But it is a much smaller group of universities in the UCAT. Effectively everywhere else is the UCAT. So it's broken down into 3 sections that are very, very distinct and very separate. And they are actually timed separately. There's no going between them. So section 1, they used to call it action skills. It's now called thinking skills. 32 questions, and it's all about problem solving, critical thinking, and kind of data interpretation and inference. It's kind of the biggest section. It takes 60 minutes. And this is all of your kind of bits and pieces you can relate to the UCAT. So there's a bit of verbal reasoning in there. There's their take on abstract. There's some critical thinking and some mathsy type questions. And this is kind of where you'll see the similarity to the UCAT exam if you've been looking at that. It's lots of interpreting text and arguments and knowledge, that sort of thing. But then this is where it kind of stops the similarity. So section 2 is science and scientific knowledge. This is biology, chemistry, physics, and maths. Now, this is supposed to be to GCSE level. However, I will say that the way they ask their questions can be very different to the way you answer them at GCSE. And also, you need to make sure that you are comfortable with the questions they ask. So there might be stuff that they ask in their GCSE level syllabus that doesn't come up in your GCSE level syllabus. So there will be some things you may not have covered or may not have covered in as much depth as they expect you to know. That's another 30 minutes. And then section 3 is an essay question. So you get 3 questions and you have to write an essay on one. It's 1 page, regardless of the size of your writing. And that's marked both on your content and your grammar. So somebody just asked, after finishing one section, is the paper taken away so you can't go back? Effectively, yeah, you cannot go back between the sections. Once your 60 minutes is up for section 1, that's it. Once your 30 minutes is up for section 2, that's it. Okay. So we'll break down each section though, so it's not quite so scary. How they mark it is really interesting, and actually the scores can kind of be a little bit deceiving. So in sections 1 and 2, you get 1 mark. And they basically convert your marks from a raw number to a BMAT scale. And what they do is they compare the score you got to what the standard score would be. So it's between 1 and 9, but actually most people will get around 5. Somebody just very quickly asked if we can send out the PowerPoint. Of course, we normally try and make a recording of these and put those up and send you the link to them. So I'll show you some distributions later of score. And in section 3, like we said, you get marked by 2 people, 2 separate examiners. Each examiner will give you 2 scores, 1 for how you've written it between 0 and 5, and then 1 for your English, which is normally A to E. Now, I will say there's kind of a little bit around, if the 2 examiners disagree by quite a lot, then they ask a 3rd examiner to come in and moderate. And the 3rd examiner will always be a BMAT senior examiner. So that's just something to bear in mind. Actually, it's quite fair how they mark it, but it can be quite daunting. So section 1, let's break it down. You've got 3 main areas you need to think about. Critical thinking, which is like the language part of it, problem solving using math, and data analysis and inference, which is complex data, 3D interpretation, that sort of thing. The biggest thing to say about the BMAT is that you cannot use a calculator at any point. That applies to this section and also to your biology, chemistry, and physics sections. So, 3 main areas. You'll either be asked to identify assumptions and conclusions, to detect flaws in an argument, or draw conclusions from an argument. And normally you'll have around 2 to 4 marks in each of these sections. And the reason there's a scale there is that just sometimes they'll go for more of one area, more of another, but on the whole, over the years, this is how many sections you'll have. So what would I say to do? First of all, you need to understand the argument. What are they trying to get across in this question? What do they want you to know? Why have they written it? There's a lot around what did the author write this piece for? So the way I always think to go for it is read the question first, then read the passage, then read the answers. And the reason I say to do it that way is because if you read the question, that'll keep you thinking when you're reading the passage. But if you haven't read the answers, you're not trying to automatically link them across, because ideally you should look at the answers afterwards and know which one is right. My other tips would just be to read as much as possible. If you're not someone who's reading regularly, you'll find this really difficult because the passages they give you aren't sort of easy to read. They're not generally, they're there to catch you out almost. And things that I would be aware of are things like prior knowledge. So sometimes they'll ask you things that they know you will know from your own knowledge, but actually you have to base it on the paragraph in front of you. Also, they'll try and like give you false logic. So they'll make it look like one thing that leads to another, that leads to another, but actually they don't. And the final thing I say is really common is juxtaposition. So this is when you put two statements next to each other, and then you basically have to, you assume that those two statements are linked, but actually there's a full stop in the middle and they're two separate statements. Okay, so we've just asked, do we take the test at school? That depends where you study. So if you have a chat to your school, and you need to sit it in an exam centre. Now, some schools are BMAT exam centres, some aren't. If your school isn't, and they're not willing to let you sit it there, then you'll need to go online and look for a place near you, and you can search all the centres that let you sit the BMAT, and then you register with them. I will say, if you're not sitting at your school, the registration, the fees they charge can be quite expensive, so it's worth looking around. If you're in a big city, it's worth looking at lots of different places and seeing where you can sit it. But if you're at a normal school or sixth form, the exams centre are usually quite good, especially if they've had a few medicine applicants every year. They're quite good at putting an exam on for you, because effectively they have all the things they need. They have a registration, they have the people to watch you, the adjudicators, and they have an exam set up, whereas normally otherwise you're paying someone to do that for you. So it's worth asking your school early, because if you have to register elsewhere, especially this year with things like social distancing, they might be able to take less people. So it's worth bearing that in mind. Okay, what types of questions will you get? So these are the kind of questions they'll ask. You know, what expresses the conclusion? What are the conclusions? How are they supported? What assumptions have been made? What would weaken the argument? What would strengthen the argument? You can see how these are very technical things. They're very literary sort of concepts. You have to be able to understand everything about this argument that you're reading and know what flaws an argument or what strengthens an argument, what is an assumption and what is a conclusion. How could you illustrate the principle? And this is why I'm saying that if you're not reading regularly and thinking about these things regularly, you'll find this really difficult because it's a very technical thing to get your head around. And usually it's something that we've not done before in all of our sort of English up until now, all of our different English exams. This isn't the type of question I found that they asked. It took me a long time to get used to the type of questions they asked. So here's a good example. I'll give everybody a couple of seconds to read it, but I think it highlights nicely the type of question that they ask. If anybody's reading on phones and things and can't read it well, let me know. I can always read it out. Okay, perfect. So I'm not looking for you to, get these things right. The idea is you get a feel for what these questions look like, and they can be quite technical. So let's go through this question. We'll just break it down. So the first viewpoint that they gave was carnivores are most at risk of extinction. So that was up in the top line. It said that people believe that carnivores are most at risk of extinction. Then what they did is they challenged that. They said, yet it's likely that the opposite has been the case. So they proposed their argument for the exam. The next thing they gave was arguments to support that. And they gave arguments that are against carnivores being at risk, things like them being agile, them having their teeth, etc. Then they drew their conclusion, which is they are less vulnerable to changes in the environment. They then continue to support that argument, and they discusses that how meat continues to be meat. You know, you can move a cow around, whereas they need the grass and things to graze. Therefore, that led you to your answer, which is C, herbivores are more at risk than carnivores. I encourage you. And so you can see how I've kind of gone through that step by step. And I have skipped a few just to make it sit on the PowerPoint slide. But this is what I would encourage you, especially in the beginning, to do when you start answering these types of questions. So it's effectively going through and breaking down each argument, because when you start to see these sections, what you'll do is you will start to sort of see them when you're reading questions, and very quickly you'll be able to pick out the important bits, pick out the distractors, and then when you look at the answers, it should be quite obvious, at least in most of the cases. Do I have a list of common types of problem-solving questions and how to tackle each? Yeah, so we're going to kind of go through the main ones from section 1 today. And then if we had a bit more time, what we would do is literally break down every single type and sort of what to look out for. But this is what I would do. So just break down each argument the best you can, and sort of what is an argument, what strengthens an argument, what weakens an argument, what's a conclusion, what, you know, undermines that conclusion, what's a flaw of an argument, those sorts of things. Because in the beginning, you have lots and lots of time. Whereas in the end, you know, when you're practicing that, whereas you want to get quicker and quicker and quicker at it. So when you're under time pressure, you can still do these. Perfect. So there's 3 types of questions. You know, you're basically going to be looking for a relevant selection or finding something. And then the last one is where you have to identify similarities. And so you'll see these in a minute. These are a very different type of question to everything else. Are they always non-fiction text? Usually, yeah. They usually are either, you know, scientific data or a piece of text like that, or an argument, things like that. So for the second section, the problem solving. So just to clarify, because somebody said about problem solving questions, I've called these critical thinking. So that's the first bit where you get the paragraphs. And then I've called the next bit problem solving, which is kind of the maths bit with the data. So which is what we're going to do now, just because you've happened to call it problem solving in the question. I don't want to confuse anyone. So the problem solving here is basically identifying data and using procedures. Okay. So you must know all of your stuff you'd expect, and you must know it really well. So fractions, arithmetic, algebra, money, time, area, perimeter, volume, and tables and graphs. And the thing is not doing it, is doing it quickly. I'm doing it without a calculator. So the biggest tip I can give you is practice mental maths. Lots and lots of marks are lost here, not because people don't know how to get to the answer, but because they can't do the maths to get to the answer. And certainly they can't do it quickly. Okay, it takes a long time to get good at the maths you need to do. It's simple shortcuts, like knowing your times tables inside out. So if you need to do 13 times 12, you know the answer like that. Recognizing squared numbers, you know, if somebody says 91, you know that's 9 squared. If somebody says 625, you know your squared numbers, know your cube numbers, at least the ones that come up regularly, because these will speed you up so much. Normally the questions can be figured out, however, it just takes that extra step of maths. But the more you practice, the better it will get. Percentages, decimals, and fractions, it's really, really worth knowing how these numbers link together. You know, not just that 0.33 is 33%, 0.25 is 25%, it's also a quarter or a third. Know all those links in your head really well. What's an eighth, what's a sixth, what's a ninth, what's a, you know, this will help you just, when you look at questions, see numbers really well. And then I would say don't get distracted. And I'll show you in a question how that can happen in a minute. Just look at the bits you need. So here's a good example of a question. You know, they've said that you can buy these 3 types of coffee, and there's 25% extra for the normal price. And if you buy a large jar, you get a small jar free. So if you buy a large jar of coffee, what's the total extra percentage of the normal price? So on the face of it, it's a simple percentage-based question, okay, which you should be able to work through. And actually, you can waste a lot of time. You can look at those answers and know that when you're trying to work out 33.3 or 56.25% of something, that's not simple maths. But actually, there's a bit of exam technique that comes in, and you can get distracted by getting the exact answer. So, large coffee plus 25%, 500 grams, 400 grams divided by, divide it down, work out what a quarter is, add that on. So, 1.25, 500 grams. Then you must do the same for the small coffee, because you also get an extra 25% on the small coffee jar that you get for free. And that's something people forget. So it's important to read the question. And then you get your 625 grams for 400 grams, you get 225 extra. Now this is the bit that is difficult. Trying to work out 56.25% as the answer very quickly without having to do all the maths yourself. What I would say though, is that 225 to 400 is roughly 50%. It's just more than 50%. 200 would be 50. And so if you look at the answers again, it can't be D, because we know it's more than that. And it's definitely not 87.5%, that's too much. And so without actually having to figure it out, the answer must be 56.25. And sometimes things like that can save you lots of time, because actually you don't need to do this last step, which I would say is probably the most difficult step mathematically to do. You can just look at the answers and know that one's right. And that's something to bear in mind. Like I was saying, don't get distracted and focused in on doing every step. Sometimes exam technique can help. Okie dokie. Then this last section I found really difficult, and I think lots of people do. It's this whole idea of interpretation of shape and three-dimensional structures. So some of them will be textual, they'll explain things to you and you've got to interpret the plan. Some of them will be statistical and some of them will be graphical. The ones that will stand out to you are graphical. The other two you can almost mistake for the other sections. But effectively, you're going to get these like 3D shapes as 2D plans, and you've got to be able to interpret them. Ideally, you've got to be able to fold it in your head and then come to an answer and be able to see it in 3D. When I started, I couldn't do this. And what I advise everybody to do is to actually draw them out, cut them out and stick them, like fold them together. If you cannot see it in your head, try doing that because it'll help you picture it. And the more you do it, the better you'll get at it. Also, read the explanations very carefully because you're looking at something 2D and they're going to explain to you how it falls into 3D. And if you're like me and just can't get it at all, make sure you get someone to help you. Engineers and certain people have a mind that can see these types of things. I never could and had to get someone to explain it to me. So you're going to get shapes like this. So here you've got the outline of this 3D hexagon and they're going to fold it together. And your question is, so the outside is white, the inside is black. And your question is, what shapes would you be able to see through? So which of these is actually real? So you'd be able to see the white of this and the black like that. And so you basically got to be able to imagine it together and then what holes would go straight through two shapes and where would you be able to see black? Because looking through one shape, you see the black of the inside of the next. You can see very quickly how this becomes quite difficult to picture in your head. And you might very well look at that and go, I have absolutely no idea. And I wouldn't blame you at all. And just to say, all of these questions are real BMAT questions, so they're not ones that we've kind of picked out. I think because they're example questions and I'm demonstrating what the topic is, I wanted you to have an exact knowledge of what a question would look like. So this was a real BMAT question from 2014, I think, just to give you an idea. So I would completely understand if you looked at this and just didn't have a clue. But actually, you can make it slightly easier for yourself. So first of all, they're giving you two shapes. And therefore, those two shapes have to be next to each other on the real thing. So just if you were going to be like, I have no idea, I need to guess. They're two next to each here, so they have to be two next to each other on the actual shape. So A, triangle and rectangle, triangle and rectangle. So that works. A could be true. B, you've got a square and a triangle, but it's an upright triangle. Now, if you look at the upright triangle, there's no square. C, you've got a diamond and a rectangle long ways. So diamond and rectangle, that works. D, you've got a rectangle upright and a diamond. So that one does work. And E is a long rectangle and a triangle. So effectively, you've ruled out one answer already. Now you have to start thinking about where things are going to be when it folds up. So what you're going to have a look at is that if you fold this, you need to look 2 shapes away to see what would be opposite it. Okay, because if you imagine this folding down, the triangle folding down and the diamond folding up, they're going to be opposite each other. So effectively, you're always 2 shapes away from the thing you're opposite. So then if we look at the triangle, the answer A, so the triangle is going to be opposite the diamond. So actually, this works. And then the square is going to be opposite the long ways rectangle. So again, that works. And that's why, so the answer to this is A, and that's the explanation as why. But it just gives you an idea of the sort of thing you're dealing with. It's a very different way to think into any exam you'll have done in the past. And I appreciate that explanation might have just, not made sense. I'm happy to go through it again if anybody wants to send me a message and we can talk about it separately. But I know these questions are difficult. So for section 1, this is the distribution of scores. Okay, this is typically how people do. So you can see that everybody is kind of bumped up in the middle, and it's very difficult to get past sort of 5.5 to 6. It just drops off massively downwards, and almost nobody is getting 8.59. So this is where you need to aim to be. If you can get past that 5.5 mark and into the 6, that makes you a very competitive applicant. If you can move past 6 into 6.5, you have done exceptionally well. Okay, and this is where we'd be aiming for you to be, is that 6 to 6.5 bracket, because that makes you extremely competitive for section 1. But you can see the distribution. It's very difficult to get this side. Actually, it's easier to end up, from 4 downwards. But you can see why. If you're underprepared, it's not going to work. These are not questions that you can do just without practicing. Okay, so that's section 1 done. Okay, section 2. This is your kind of biology, chemistry, physics, and maths. So the UCAT universities work on the theory that actually you're doing A levels, so therefore you should know your biology, chemistry, physics, and maths. Actually, what the BMAT universities say is that they don't always insist that you've got biology, chemistry, and physics, or maths, and most don't insist on maths. Therefore, they want to test that you've still got enough baseline knowledge of all of them, because you might only be doing A-level chemistry and then other subjects, or even A-level chemistry and biology. It's very rare that somebody's going to do A-levels in all 4 of these topics. And so they just want to test your underlying knowledge. Now, the biggest thing I would say is that it's equally distributed, but the questions themselves can be very different to what you sat at GCSE. So obviously this exam is set by the Cambridge admissions testing group, which don't set GCSE exams. And so although they say it's at GCSE level, and there will be some overlaps, there are also things that are different, and you need to bear that in mind. So there is a syllabus that they've released for each section. So up until about 2016, there was no syllabus. And then people had kind of guessed what would be on the exam, and then it changed. So now they're quite honest, and they say, this is what we're going to examine you on. Okay, and what I've done in the next few slides is I've broken down exactly how it's laid out. And what I would say as well is that I've laid these out in the difficulty order that I think you should tackle them in, and also in the subjects that I think you should tackle them in. Okay, and this is kind of based on what people find most difficult and also what comes up the most. So I would always start with physics. Everybody is different, but over the years of tutoring and things, I found that people find physics the most difficult by far. So start with it early. Always start with electricity. It's a complex topic. It's got a few things in it you might not get. There's some stuff in there that wouldn't have been examined at GCSE. And also it comes up every single year. If there's one subject I can guarantee will come up, it's electricity. Then I'd go through energy and force, because you've got all of your Newton's laws and formulas in there that you've probably forgotten from GCSE. Going through your atom stuff after that, then heat and temperature, then waves, and then other applications. Somebody said, should we study magnetism? Absolutely, magnetism does come up. I think when I was going through the syllabus, I applied it in with like energy and force, but absolutely, magnetism is in there. So you'll have to go back through how like electromagnets work and those sorts of bits and pieces. But yeah, magnetism is in there. So you can see that everything that came from GCSE physics is in there, but also there will be a few things you'll come across that you either haven't seen before or with very small parts of GCSE that they've then decided to focus on. Okay, after physics, I'll go for chemistry, because again, I think this is in order of difficulty. And then I've listed them again in the order that I would personally revise them. So start with chemical concepts. If you don't have your chemical concepts down, you effectively won't be able to do everything after that. And so I kind of put that one there, not because it comes up the most, but it kind of does because it's in every question. You need to have your formulas down. You need to know how to interpret them, how to rearrange them, all those sorts of things. Next, equations and calculations. If you haven't got the way your maths work and your equations work in chemistry, you're going to find the other questions really hard, because you'll find that they ask a question on something, and then later on down the line, you have to use a formula or an equation to get to the answer. And if you haven't got that bit down, it doesn't matter that you had the knowledge for the question, you kind of missed your trick, so to speak. Then I'll do chemical analysis. Electrolysis will come back, you know, all of the things about analyzing chemicals, identifying chemicals, all of your flame tests and things like that, as well as electrolysis and, you know, what will go to the anode, what will go to the cathode. Just go back through all those sorts of things. Most people are doing A-level chemistry, so they find that they can whistle through these quite quickly. But if you aren't, it's a really big section. And if you are, there's things that don't focus, especially in AS chemistry, you don't focus on, that will come up here. The stuff on rocks and things I know is a big one, and water pollution doesn't always get a big focus in A-level, but actually you did quite a lot of it at GCSE. Then I do your reaction rates, your enthalpy changes, things like that. And then classifying materials, chemical changes, and water pollution. So somebody's just asked, what does rocks cover? And I will, if you give me a second while I'm going through biology, I will pull up my presentation on the chemistry bits that I normally go through when we're going through this on the course, because that kind of goes through every sort of bit that comes up. Righty-ho. So then finally, biology. Now this bit is the bit that most people really enjoy, because it's all the kind of human applications of biology. You've got your cells, organs, nerves, genes, energy flow. Certainly if you're doing A-level biology, you're going to find this section quite straightforward. Right, rocks. So it's normally, from what I can remember, it's the basis of like geology, effectively, is what you're looking at. So, and also highlighting what's in different, like how to break down a rock, what to identify what's in it, as well as some of your basic geology. Yeah, how to identify a metal in a rock, that sort of thing. Perfect. And then maths. So again, a bit like the first one, but there's a bit more to this math section. The last one was kind of using maths in the set, like in a problem-solving situation. This one is, just admit somebody. This one's much more about actual maths questions. So you'll get your algebra in there, your geometry, probability. You're going to get your shapes. You know, you have to interpret the shapes and work out volumes, much like sort of GCSE math questions. But again, there is types of questions they ask in here that they won't ask in a GCSE. So worth having a look. And you can see this is a difficult section. If you look at this graph, this is worse than section 1. So people typically don't do well in this section. You know, the average is 3.5 out of 9, which is quite interesting. But considering that when you did GCSE on the whole, you didn't have multiple choice, now you do. And so you'd think you'd do better. But actually on the whole, people struggle to get to this 4.55, 5.56 area. But it is definitely achievable. You can see that actually the 5.5 and the 5 are quite high, but the majority of people end up over here. And some of that, I think, is because this section gets neglected. Because section 1 is quite difficult, and section 3 people find very difficult because they don't do writing very often. They kind of think, well, I know biology, chemistry, and physics. And they flick through some of the questions and they think, yes, I can do those. Actually, what you've got to remember is it's not just about being able to do the questions. It's the fact that the questions that you think are easy, everybody thinks they're easy. And you've got to remember that your score is scaled. So you are, you know, trying to compare yourself to the other candidates, and you're trying to compare yourself to the normal distribution that they've allocated to the marks this year. So what that means is sometimes the one extra mark can push your score up quite a lot, because you've got something right that the majority of people didn't, if that makes sense. And so that's why every single mark does count. and you really have to kind of get the questions right that other people are going to find difficult. And that's where the practice comes in. It's those little things that will help you push onwards that little bit more. This is also quite a time pressured section. So you saw that it was 7, 7, 7, and 6. So you've got 27 questions, but you've only got 30 minutes to do it. So it's about a minute a question. And some of them can be quite different, and then, you know, there's quite a few steps to them. Perfect. So yeah, you want to obviously be over here. If you can get, again, a 5.5 would put you in a really competitive place for your application. And then lastly is the writing task. And I think this is the one that certainly people applying to medicine find the most difficult. Not because writing is more difficult, it's just something that typically we don't do very often. You know, we're very good at writing scientifically and answering questions and breaking down formulas and things. But what we don't do is write essays. And I will say there's a group of people who always do exceptionally well at this, who I kind of exclude, which is people who are doing psychology A level, and because they do lots of essay writing. But if you're not doing lots of writing, and you know you're not, this is something you need to address really, really early, because this takes some time to get right and to get practice. Effectively, you've got 3 questions, and you have to write an essay on one of them. You've got 1 page, and you've got 30 minutes to do it. And this is the sort of thing they might give you. So you can see here, they've made 3 statements. One's normally a philosophy question, one's normally a science question, and then one's more of like an ethicsy type question. And so this is what you'd get, something like, there's no such thing as dangerous speech. It's up to people to choose how they react. And then they give you this little blurb as well that says, explain the reasoning behind this statement, argue to the contrary, that there can be instances of dangerous speech. To what extent should society put limitations on speech or text that it considers threatening? So you can see this isn't like a write an essay on this. They've given you a title, they've said just go with it. And you've got to remember, you've never seen these set questions before. So you've got no time to go away and research it. You have to have enough background knowledge about science and medicine and literature and philosophy and the world at large to answer this question off the top of your head in 30 minutes, articulate an argument, write it grammatically correctly, and kind of break that down. And this is the bit that people find really difficult. And I know it's certainly the bit that I found difficult. Somebody just asked, can you use case studies? Absolutely. And when I come on in a minute to strategies, I would encourage you to use things like case studies. Obviously, it's just making sure you know a case study that can link into the question that you haven't seen before. But knowing that they fit into those kind of broad categories can mean you can have kind of case studies in your head that fit into broad categories. So, you know, in terms of things like dangerous speech, you might have a case study that you can link to there. And then, but just in terms of speech in general and people talking and like consequences of reaction, you might have some things in your head that are relevant. Then, you know, for science, you know, overall science case studies are things that have moved the world forward, like antibiotics or drugs and medication, things that you know have moved the world forward. And then finally, the ethical studies are really, I mean, they're really useful because you're learning for your BMAT, but you're also learning for things like your interview as well. And you can see again, they're getting you to argue to the contrary. So you have to kind of come up with the opposite as well. Is there some specific reading that we should do? Specific is difficult. There is a book that I would recommend that I'll talk about in a minute. But on the whole, I think it's generally having an awareness of what's going on. So reading things like the news, reading arguments and knowing about like big arguments, so like the Bauer-Garber case, knowing about the Charlie Gard case, all these typical things that come up quite a lot, the junior doctor's contract, having a sort of introduction to ethics and knowing about different ethical frameworks, knowing about deontology and utilitarianism and the like pillars of ethics, so you can kind of refer to those when you're thinking about how to form an argument. So how I would approach this is like really think about which question you answer and make sure it's the one that you can answer best. There's 3 there for a reason. They haven't been harsh enough to only give you 1, but you haven't got time to change your mind. I would still spend a couple of minutes planning. I think you've only got 1 page. You've got to be concise and succinct, and you've got to articulate yourself in a way that makes it sound like you really have highlighted in what you're doing. And I think if you're just writing off the top of your head, you can't do that. I would then plan your layout really well. Make sure that you know that you are introducing here, you're going to make this point, you're going to have an argument here that makes this point with this case study. So when you actually start writing, it all comes together really well. Write small and legibly. If you have big writing, you don't get more paper. Okay, you have one page, regardless of how big your writing is, to fill that page. And some people think this is really harsh, and I do agree with you that I know people who've got really small writing and can write twice as much, and just physically on the page. But we don't set the exams. So, and also, if it's not legible, they will not read it. They're not going to try and decipher it. They make it very clear every year that if they can't read it, they won't mark it. So I know that you're rushing, but you must make sure it's at least still legible. So I would say practice is the biggest thing you can do for this. You can write about anything, but get used to writing again. Time yourself. Everybody could write the perfect essay if they had all the time in the world, because you could do some research, you can write it down. And sometimes as a practice, that can be useful. But actually, I would get used to timing yourself. 30 minutes goes so quickly. And by the time you've read the questions, decided, done some planning, laid it out, and then start writing, that goes so quickly. And you need to just make sure that you've got kind of used to what 30 minutes feels like, so that you don't get halfway through and then have to stop. I would say at least get a few of your essays marked. Now, if you've got people in your school or college or wherever you're applying from that are used to BMAT essays, by all means, they can have a look at it. Look at some marked essays online. But I would say, and I know I'm biased because I'm in the business of admissions, but I honestly believe that getting them marked by people who have marked BMAT essays is so important. And this is one of those areas that I really feel that lots of people try and rip you off when the only BMAT essays that they've written are their own, and then they're trying to mark other people's. Get people who have years and years of experience, because they'll tell you what's right, what's wrong, what gets you the marks. And also the English of it, because you need to we'll look at the marks in a minute, and the typical thing, you need to get that A for your English language. If you don't get an A, you have massively disadvantaged yourself. The book that I would recommend is Introduction to Philosophy, and there's lots of them on Amazon. It doesn't matter which one you read, just an introduction to philosophy. Get your head around the way people think and the way people form arguments and break down arguments. I will pop in the chat one that I have recommended to people before, but effectively any introduction to philosophy works really well. It's just giving you an idea of how to think. And then the other one that I'd recommend that comes up in interviews, but also is really useful here, is the short introduction to medical ethics, which is a tiny little book. You could read it in a day, but it just helps. So I'm just trying to multitask and send you the link to, here you go. So this is the book that I would recommend for philosophy. It's called Think, and it's just a compelling introduction to philosophy. It breaks down what philosophy is and how to think about things. And it's really useful for BMAT. It's also just really useful for any sort of essay writing you do. Lots of universities will have essay competitions that help you apply for bursaries and things if you get a place. And again, it'll help with that. I think it helps with your verbal reasoning for UCAT and for your section 1. So do you have to write about essay writing practice if we already do an essay subject? Probably not as much, but just be aware, a bit like the biology, chemistry, and physics, I would approach it like that you're probably okay at it, but the way they pitch it and the way they mark it is different. And so you just have to bear that in mind, especially if you're not doing the whole forming an argument, here's a point for that, forming another argument later for and against, drawing a conclusion and stating why you've drawn that conclusion. That's the kind of bits that I would just bear in mind. And then, like we were saying, I would have banks of examples. So when we go through the course, we kind of go through what would be a good example for philosophy, what would be a good example for medicine, and we kind of give you 10 or 15 different examples that you could just basically use yourself, because they're examples, they're out there in the world. It doesn't have to be unique to you. Okay, but I think doing them lots, do an essay every week and get it marked by someone, so you can kind of build up that experience. The good thing with the BMAT is that every single mock exam, every single exam they've ever done is still online. And although they've changed a little bit, not to do the full page essays in section 1, etc. they're all still there. So for things like essay titles, you've got 3 essay titles for every year since like 2004. So it's lots and lots and lots of stuff for you to go back through. So you can see here, this is what I was talking about. People do very well for the quality of English. So you need to get that A, because effectively everybody else is. Now, that's quite easy if you do lots of writing, because you'll quickly pick up on your spelling and grammar being wrong and just improving on it. In terms of quality of content, it's very easy to do okay and get the middle 3. And actually, you can see up to 35% almost get the 3. It's very difficult then to drop into this 3.5 and 4. So to go from 3 to a 4, you've gone from over a third of candidates to less than, almost 5%. So it is getting that other side of it. And again, it's one of those that to do okay, you can get there with a little bit of practice. To do well, you need to really push through that barrier and be writing on that extra level than other people. All right. And I think that is hard. So this is kind of our strategy. I would say make sure you've got your concepts down, get your biology, chemistry, physics, and maths down, go through essay writing, go through aptitude tests, build your content up, write strong essays, and then make sure you're hitting the criteria. Okay, just as a kind of overall conclusion. And if I'm going to plug a little bit, if you do think you need a little bit of help with this, we have put on a course. So typically we don't run courses for like the general public. What we tend to do is go into schools and deliver courses to schools. But this year we can't do that just because of the coronavirus. And so we have decided to run a couple of online courses. We've got a UCAT one and a BMAT one, just to kind of, for those people who think they need that little bit more help or that little bit more kind of going through stuff. It's just a day where you can spend focusing in with doctors, breaking down each section, going through strategies for each section. We always send you like a mini mock before, which is what we used to do in the school, so you can kind of have a go, see what you got right, see what you got wrong, and also break down what you got wrong. I think there's always a temptation to go through kind of thousands and thousands of questions and not actually know why you're getting them wrong, which is why we send the mock before. On the day, we'll go through exactly how to break down every type of question from section 1. We'll go through the biology, chemistry, and physics. We'll break down the whole syllabus. We'll give you the bits that we think don't come up in GCSE. And then in the essay writing, we'll break down exactly how to write an essay, what you need to include. We'll give you the whole sets of all your examples that you'll need for the essay writing. And as I say, the whole idea is that this is not expensive. We basically just need to cover the costs of having a website and the resources that we print and things like that. And so, making sure that doctors can actually justify doing this. And so it's normally, we've said £60, and then we've said, actually, because you're here today, we'd drop it to 50. We normally have 1 doctor to about 10 students, just as a rough idea. So you really are well focused on. We also have admin staff on the day, so they can kind of be there to help answer questions and things, and kind of make sure we as doctors don't just yap on and actually focus on the questions. So it's generally a really good day. We've always really enjoyed giving them. We just didn't want to miss out doing the courses this year effectively. And so I'll pop a link in the chat. I would say of those 20 spaces, I think I checked beforehand, and there's about 11 left at the moment. Just through our bursary scheme, we've already allocated a few, and people who were already doing coaching with for the BMAT have already taken a few. So, so I'll pop the link in there if you just want to get a head start. Somebody asked if we'll do a course later in the year. We will probably do more courses, which, as I say, it's been really good fun. We're basically redesigning all of our courses to deliver online, to keep them interactive and things. So we probably will aim to run another one sort of like August time, but we know that some people are already asking for them, and we had enough people to do one, but we wanted to offer one if people want to get started early. Perfect. So just to say what's coming up, obviously we're here now. Next week we're doing a personal statement webinar, just again, a bit of a run through of the personal statement, and then we've got these different courses coming up. The other thing that I haven't mentioned, because it's kind of the furthest away, is we've got a personal statement hackathon. We're basically going to have as many doctors as we can, people who are experienced with personal statements, in one room. You guys can all come in. We'll go through exactly what to put in your personal statement in the morning, and then all day you can just send draft after draft after draft after draft of different bits of the sections, as a means to kind of, in a day, get a really good strong draft of a personal statement. So we're looking forward to that. But we'll talk about that more a little bit next week. So I suppose the last thing I have to ask is, anybody got any questions, either about the BMAT, about admissions, about anything really? I'm happy to, we've got about 10 minutes to go through any questions. I think I've answered most as we've got along, but if anybody's got any, do you have to pay for the personal statement hackathon? It will have a small charge. It'll be less than these. I think we said, I'm just trying to have a look now what we said, because I put it on the website a little while ago. I think we said it'd be like £25 for the day. So, you know, you can put as many reviews in that day as you want, and the £25 covers you for the whole day. And then we said we'd probably also do, with included in that, like a 7-day follow-up. So you can send another draft 7 days later, and we'll have a read through that as well and kind of go through it line by line and send you lots of feedback back. How long ahead of the BMAT do you suggest preparing? So I think preparation for the BMAT is a bit different to the UCAT because it depends what your background is. I always would say that sort of 2 to 3 months before, I'd like to get familiar with the content, so know what sort of questions are coming up. Do webinars like this. Just understand everything that's going to happen. And then 6 to 8 weeks before, that's when I would really want to be focusing in and revising the questions, going through, you know, having a plan, answering questions, doing mocks every day. But I would say with that, if you know that you're going to really struggle with like the maths or physics, or you know you're going to really struggle with the 3D interpretation or the essay writing, that's when I would say, actually, you probably need to spend that little bit more time on that. And there's parts of it that I would start doing now. So although we're miles behind in June now, I would start doing things like reading a little bit more, reading articles online, keeping up with the healthcare news, talking to doctors and getting an idea of what's going on, and then just getting a feeling over that. Should we prioritize UCAT over BMAT because it's sooner? I think that's a sensible thing to do. You know you're not going to set the BMAT until November. That being said, there's always a risk, and I see it with the UCAT as well, where people think, I'll do it later on in the year to give myself more time to prepare. And then you go back to college, you've got your applications, you start A-levels again, you know, everything starts up again, and suddenly you don't have as much time to dedicate to it as you would over the summer. So I think that's something just to bear in mind. But effectively, you can sit the UCAT a lot sooner. And so if you're organized, in my head, what I would do is plan to do the UCAT early, and then after the UCAT, you've still got the majority of summer left of August, September time to plow into the BMAT. Are there any virtual work experience sites we could use? What would they be? So I mentioned this last week, and I'm going to be a little bit controversial now, but please don't pay for virtual work experience. Over the years, I've done lots of interviews for Imperial, and we've had people do all sorts of things. And I can say with a lot of certainty, it doesn't actually build that much on your application. You need to have work experience, but paying for it doesn't make you better than someone who didn't. And the reason I mention this is I saw earlier this week somebody was offering paid work experience for like £100. And I just thought that was wrong, if I'm being honest. So Brighton and Sussex are offering virtual work experience at the moment, and that's been endorsed by the Medical Schools Council, going through like cases and things, as well as the Royal College of GPs have offered something called Observe GP, which is effectively a observation of a GP. And both of those virtual work experiences have been endorsed by the Medical Schools Council, and they're the people who overall manage medical schools admissions in the UK. So I would definitely advise doing both of those. Then I would think about doing things like research. So can you do any reading on a topic? Have you got any interest in a topic? And then is there any like local people you could reach out to do some research with? Because lots of that can be done virtually. So research is a big one. And then think about things like, and as COVID dies down, all the normal ones like care homes. And then hospitals will be still looking for volunteers, just in a different capacity as we go forward. But please don't pay for work experience. I just don't think, I've had people do open university degrees in like public health as a look at my interest in medicine. And although it was very good, we looked at it for a second and said, oh, that was good. And they paid £3,000 or £4,000 to do that course. Okie dokie. Should we revise for biology, chemistry, physics, and math section 2 in the same deck that we revised for our GCSEs? To a certain degree, yes. Like when you start seeing the questions, they're not easy. You know, they are deep questions. You'll need to know the topics really well. I would say there's probably, You could probably focus in a little bit more. Like when you start answering the questions, you'll see that certain things come up lots. But that being said, you do need to know the syllabus inside out. On the BMAT website, there is a syllabus that they've published. I will post a link to it for you because I've got it open. But effectively, you need to know that syllabus inside out and back to front. So it depends on what A-levels you're doing, how much time you're spending preparing for your A-levels, and then the new stuff. Could you advise on how to manage time for managing mocks, UCAT, BMAT applications? Yeah, so we kind of touched on this when we did our introduction to medicine webinar a couple of weeks ago, but this is one of the reasons that I feel really sorry for people applying for medicine, in the sense that it's a great career and I think it's the best job in the world, but you have to start planning it from the age of 14, 15, which just doesn't seem right. You do have to be extremely organized, because I can guarantee you there are applicants out there who are, and you need to be competitive. So in terms of roughly how I'd manage time, and I'm happy to kind of talk to people individually for a bit more detail. Your summer this year is the best thing you've got, okay? You need to do the majority of your work now. If you're looking at applying for a UCAT and a BMAT, which most people are, then I would say focus in on UCAT now, get it done early, then focus on the BMAT and your personal statement, so that when you go back in September, you can focus on your application and A-levels, and work experience needs to happen little and often, okay? So I would be doing if you can do a morning a week or something like that, just so that you've got something that's over a course of time. And then on top of that, if you can arrange any shadowing, and universities are being very, very lenient this year that you don't have to have had shadowing because of the coronavirus pandemic. But if you can arrange anything, or even just have discussions with doctors, and we're more than willing to chat to people about what hospital life is like, how you might find it, but ultimately nothing will prepare you more than actually living it and feeling it. Work experience is only there to obviously make sure that you're not going to get there and drop out and it not be the job for you. Everybody's different, and some people just can cope with it and find it exhilarating. Some people don't like it. Okay. How much wider reading should we aim to do if we're applying to Oxbridge or a Russell Group? So reading is a skill for life at the end of the day. I think you should be doing lots of reading. You need to have an understanding of society as a whole, what's going on, especially in healthcare and the NHS. What is the current research that's going on? Are you aware of the changes to dexamethasone with coronavirus 19? The fact that that's been registered as a drug? What's the research around that? What's the numbers to treat? Is it a good thing to publish it in the media? Because the more you read, the more you'll come across these questions. And read from a variety of sources as well. There's non-fiction books in medicine. Also read research papers. Read articles on the BBC Health is great, but also from other places. You get different sort of beliefs. Do you think we should do research into medicine related topics? If you can, it looks great. I mean, an EPQ is probably the most accessible way these days that people are doing research. But actually, there's nothing stopping you reaching out to local people that, local labs that you're interested in, say, cancer research, and saying, do you need help with data analysis or a literature review or anything like that? If you've been in hospital yourself, I hope I have been, what's the best way to include this in your personal statement without sounding cliche? So yeah, this is really difficult every year. It's honestly about not what you've done, it's about what you learned from it. So there's no point saying that, I was in an operating theatre and I observed the most complex neurosurgery in the country with breaking technology. Because that doesn't actually say you've learned anything from it. It just says that you stood there and saw it. And actually you could see that on YouTube or, on a video. What you need to say is that while I was there, I saw the teamwork, and I saw, it's about what you learned. Did you see teamwork? Did you see emotional struggle? Did you see communication skills? Did you see teaching? Did you see the relevance of research and technical aspects of medicine, et cetera, et cetera? It's all about how to do that. Should we include coronavirus in our personal statement? So this is kind of a interesting thing, and it's coming up a lot at the moment. My answer honestly would be, it depends on the impact it's had on you and whether it fits. You shouldn't shoehorn it in. But if there's a genuine tie into your personal statement around the virus, that's something I would consider. Must we do an EPQ? Absolutely not, but it is a good way of demonstrating a heavy amount of research that you've done. And it gives you one topic that you know inside out and back to front. Do you think the virtual work experience alone is enough to reflect on? It's difficult to know, because obviously we've never gone through an application cycle with the virtual work experience. What I would say is that aim to do as much as possible. It's always the same. Aim to do as much as possible. Aim to go through as much as possible. If you can't do that, and that's what you've got, that's what you have to reflect on. But actually, there's normally other things in your life that you can break down as well. You know, even if it's just other experiences at school, at college, in your life, etc. What's the best framework for reflection in personal statements or interviews? So it depends what it is. I always think that you kind of, people talk about things like the STAR framework, which I think works really well, where you talk about what the situation was, what you did, what the kind of your actions were, and what the resulting facts were, and then how did you reflect on it. And it's all about reflection. Effectively, no matter which way it goes, you want to kind of break down into reflecting on what you learned and how it changed you. Does doing an EPQ in a medically endorsed topic count for more? I don't know if it necessarily counts for. I think it just gives you something in the medical field. It shows that you've done some research in the medical field, and it gives you something to talk about. I find that the EPQs come up much more in interview, that it gives you something to talk about. It makes you sound like a strong candidate and necessarily helping get you to interview. There's very few universities that rank you higher for having an EPQ, but it does mean that your ability to talk on science is great. Can you recommend any websites for accessible research papers considering we're only AS students? So the best one is the Student BMJ. That's aimed at students, and things like Student BMJ and the Sharp Scratch podcast are great. Otherwise, BBC Health, just for basic, introductions to things like what's going on in the world and stuff, and getting an idea of just the headlines. And then going from there, I would say, look at research in an area that interests you, and then maybe you can focus in more then. But the Student BMJ is a great place to start. So the podcast is called Sharp Scratch. What I'll do is I'll put a link. We've got a list of podcasts that people might find interesting on our website. So I'll pop a link to that now. I didn't Sharp Scratch. There we go. There we go. So it's called BMJ Sharp Scratch. But there's lots on there, and I've said sort of why I'd recommend them. Oh, sorry, that's gone to one person, not everybody. There we go. Perfect. How long should we be studying for the UCAT right now? So depending on when you're planning on booking your exam, obviously you've got this period that you can book it in. I always say that you need a good 6 to 8 weeks. Once you're comfortable with the exam and you know what you're going to kind of do, I would then say you need 6 to 8 weeks just to really focus in on revise, doing mocks, breaking down each question, making sure if there's any weak sections, you boost them up. So that's how I would kind of timeline it. When we're doing interview webinars, absolutely, we always focus on interviews. It's kind of it's certainly one of the things I find most interesting because you get to hear people's stories. But we'll probably do that later on in the year because nobody's going to have an interview before October. Is it better to have a running interest within medicine throughout the personal statement, e.g. neurology, or show an interest in lots of areas of medicine? It depends on you as a person. If you have an interest that kind of feeds through your story, your personal statement should go like a story in my eyes. And if that interest kind of tiles through with you, that's fine. However, I don't think it should at the expense of proving points about you. So if you can't think of a way that neurology helped you teach, don't talk about it. Talk about something else that lets you demonstrate how you taught and how you reflected on that. So it depends on how that interest fits into your personal statement as a whole, because ultimately you want a personal statement that sells you the best, not a personal statement that kind of ties into this one area of medicine. Because also I can say I went into medicine wanting to do one thing and I absolutely don't want to do that anymore. And medical schools know this. They know you're not going to do, on the whole, what you come in to do, because you change as a person and you realize medicine changes. And so what they want is somebody who's interested. I would say you don't want somebody who's so focused on one thing, because that typically says that as a student you won't pay attention to other areas. So they do want you to not be completely focused on being the next neurosurgeon. You can have that in the back of your head by all means, but on the whole I would say don't focus on one thing just at the detriment of selling yourself as a person. Okay. Perfect. So I think that's all the questions that we've had through. As always, I'll send a follow-up email to this just with kind of a few summary points and a few links and things. If anybody does have any questions, feel free to either email us or send us a private message on Instagram. My email is just travis@medicadmissions.co.uk. So I'm always happy to reply to people's emails and things. Similarly, if you are wondering if you want to sign up for next week's webinar, I will pop a link to that in the email that I send out, as well as a link to the BMAT course. As I said, there is that discount code as well for the BMAT course if you're interested. But ultimately, best of luck. The reason that we started Medic Admissions was to kind of form this community of people who are all applying, because ultimately you guys will be the doctors of the future that I get to work with. And so we kind of want to make sure the best people are getting through. As a final point, if you would like to benefit from all of this sort of stuff, but you think that, you know, finances are a big way of getting in the way, we do have a really good bursary scheme. So if you are interested in that, have a look on our website. We've already awarded over £2,000 worth of bursaries this year, because we are really dedicated to the right people getting into medicine. So thank you for coming. Thank you for listening. I hope it's been useful. As I say, it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the BMAT. But hopefully we can see you all next week for personal statements. I hope you all have a lovely evening. Thank you very much for coming. I'll speak to you all again soon.